Mexico has been all over the news in the past few weeks since one of its most famous drug lords, Joaquin Guzman Loera, otherwise known as El Chapo, was captured after escaping a high security prison for the second time in his career. So we've all heard of El Chapo. He's one of the most famous figures in the war on drugs, leader of the Sinaloa cartel, and even recently appeared on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. But El Chapo is just one of the hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have been transformed by the war on drugs. So today, I want to tell you about some of the people who we don't hear about so much in the news. Not the drug kingpins, but some of the low level workers who, for example, are exploited by the cartels, or some of the thousands of families who have lost loved ones to drug related violence. It's incredibly important that we pay attention to the everyday effects of drug war violence in Mexico. In part, it's important because our disproportionate focus on more powerful figures like El Chapo has helped fuel a profound misconception about the nature of the violence in Mexico. And that's the idea that it's drug dealers and illegal drugs that are the source of this violence. So first, it's time we recognize that it's not illegal drugs that are the source of this violence. It's instead precisely because drugs are illegal. It's the illegality of drugs that makes them so profitable. And it's the lack of any legal mechanism to manage their distribution which causes so much crime. Now, before I go on, I should point out that this is not a new point. Scholars, journalists, even politicians have been saying this about drug war policies for decades. And in fact, we already learned this lesson with the prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s. In retrospect, we all pretty much agree that it wasn't alcohol itself that led to the surge of violent crime in the United States in the 1920s. It was the prohibition. And it was the prohibition that led to the emergence of criminal figures like Al Capone, who was basically the El Chapo of his time. So the question is, if we know prohibition policies don't work, why have they continued? A large part of the answer to this question is that the victims of the war on drugs have been dehumanized. For example, since 2006, approximately 160,000 people have been killed in drug-related violence in Mexico. But according to the US and Mexican governments, the majority of these deaths are just criminals killing each other off. However, less than 5% of these murders are ever even investigated. So one of the things that we can learn by paying attention to the everyday effects of the war on drugs is that the violence in Mexico affects everyone. Not just criminals, not just men, but women, children, everyone. We'll also learn that those people who do become involved working in the drug trade often do so out of a necessity to survive. And finally, by paying attention to the pervasiveness of the drug wars in Mexico, we'll see that more and more there's not a meaningful distinction between the narcos and the state. First, I want to tell you about Maria Herrera Magdalena. I first met Maria in 2012 at a protest against drug war policies in San Diego. Maria is from Michoacan, and she has lost 4 sons to drug-related violence. They all worked in metal trading, and the first 2 disappeared in 2008. 2 years later, in 2010, another 2 disappeared. Every time Maria has gone to the police, she's been told the same thing. If your sons were taken, they must have been involved. By now, I have met dozens of women in Maria's situation. When they've gone to the police to report their missing children, not only do they not receive help, but they are told that their children are to blame for whatever happens to them. The failure of the government to respond to and support the families of missing people is so acute that increasingly, when someone goes missing, families don't even bother calling the police. Instead, they call people like Maria or other women like her who have appeared in the news, and they go to Maria and women like her for the support in finding their children, and in some cases, even negotiating ransoms. The fact is that nobody really knows what has happened in the majority of these cases. Maria and her family are still searching for her missing children, but they know that it's very unlikely that they've survived. Despite the violence associated with the drug trade and the ruinous consequences that it's had for so many, it's still one of the few forms of upward mobility for the poor in Mexico. It was 20-year-old Andres' experience to transitioning to a life out of prison that first drew my attention to some of the reasons why people would be drawn into working for the trade in the first place. Andres had worked as a very low-level burrero, or mule, for the drug cartels. So his job was basically to transport drugs or money from one point to another, and sometimes across the border. He was eventually caught trying to take a large shipment of drugs across the border, which is how he went to jail. When he first got out of jail, he swore he was not going to get involved with the drug trade again. According to Andres, he'd had a fairly traumatizing experience in prison, and he said that he felt that it just wasn't worth the risk getting involved again. So he started working in the kinds of jobs that were available to him in this region. For a few months, he hauled rocks for municipal road crews. For another few months, he cleaned fish for local fishing crews. But he found that ultimately he was just not able to support his family working these jobs. Mexico has one of the lowest minimum wages in all of Latin America, so this is not a situation that's unique to Andres. What he found was he wasn't able to feed his family, which at the time he was trying to support his mother, his girlfriend, and his 2 children. This was also a huge hit to his self-esteem, not being able to provide for his family, which was compounded by the fact that a few months later, his girlfriend left him. This, as well as the fact that he was facing increasing pressure from his bosses, his old bosses, to return to his work in the drug trade, finally led him back into his life as a narcotraficante, a narco trafficker. But it's not just economic reasons that draw people into the trade. There's also an important cultural context that needs to be taken into account. And I think the best example of this cultural context is the phenomenon of the narco corrido. So corridos are a genre of folk song or ballad that used to celebrate the lives and deeds of revolutionary heroes, like Pancho Villa, who was a popular lower-class military leader of the Mexican Revolution. But contemporary corridos tell the story of the lives of the men and women working in the drug trade on the border. And the musicians who play these songs and write these songs often dress up to impersonate powerful drug traffickers, with gratuitous displays of wealth and sometimes carrying around big guns. It's actually hard to exaggerate about how popular these songs are in northern Mexico especially. In the village where I've been doing research for the past 10 years, I have a neighbor named Cecilia, who's 7 years old. And she knows off by heart the lyrics to dozens of corridos. And she'll often dress up to impersonate narco traffickers when she's playing with her brothers and sisters. The popularity of narco corridos is an indication of how increasingly people are coming to identify more with narco traffickers than they are with the military and the police. And in fact, often the lyrics in these songs, in the corridos, will point to the corruption of the government. This awareness of government collusion crystallized in 2014 after 43 students disappeared from the Ayotzinapa school. The students were taken and probably killed by a drug cartel with the help of local government and police. In the tremendous outcry that followed from these events, protesters actually used this phrase as a rallying cry. No fue el narco, fue el Estado. It wasn't the narcos, it was the state. So the human impact of the war on drugs affects everyone. Not just criminals, but people like Maria, Andres, and Celia. The dehumanization of the drug war's victims is a big part of the reason that these drug policies have continued despite their spectacular failure. But that's not the whole story. There are also powerful interests at stake. The war on drugs is incredibly profitable, and not just for the cartels, who by some estimates rake in about $6.6 billion a year. But in fact, the large majority of the profits from the war on drugs go to the rich consuming countries like the UK, the United States, and Canada. For example, just think of the gun manufacturers. 70% of the guns recovered from Mexico were manufactured in the United States. The war on drugs also funds the big budget agencies like the DEA, Homeland Security, and even federal and private prisons. Then there's the incredible profits made by the banks. HSBC, Wachovia, and Bank of America have all knowingly laundered billions of dollars. For instance, in 2012, HSBC admitted to laundering billions of dollars to the drug cartels. What was even crazier? The Department of Justice decided not to press criminal charges against the bank. Instead, it opted for a financial settlement that amounted to about 5 weeks of income for the bank. So, our disproportionate focus on people like El Chapo helps obscure all this. So when we think about who's to blame for the violence of the war on drugs, we think about brown Mexicans who look like this, instead of recognizing the responsibility of people like this. This is Mike Gogan, who was the CEO of HSBC at the time that it purposefully facilitated the laundering of billions of dollars for the Sinaloa cartel. Mike never spent a day in jail. So let's be very clear. Since 2006, approximately 160,000 people have been killed in Mexico because of the war on drugs. And while Mexico has taken the brunt of this violence, this is a problem that affects all of us. There are millions of people incarcerated all over the world because of drug war policies. Addiction ruins lives. But the war on drugs ruins many, many more. So where do we go from here? Well, many Mexicans are saying, basta, enough with the war on drugs. People like Maria have devoted their lives not just to finding out what happened to their missing children, but they've also taken to the street to protest drug war policies and government corruption. They are demanding changes to the policies that have helped create so much violence in their region. Their suggestions have been on the table for some time now. Legalize drugs, stop the flow of weapons from the United States, and start putting money into public health initiatives that can actually address problems with addiction. While these suggestions aren't new, it's time that we finally listen.